Hi, Misha here, and I've been covering ships of the Imperial Japanese Navy using 1100 scale diecast models from Eagle Moss. And now we come to the final carrier, and one I nearly didn't get, but eventually got lucky. This is the Junyo of the Hiyo class, and this is a little different. It did not begin life as an aircraft carrier or even as a military ship at all, and it's a little controversial what you would classify it. It's not a light carrier, but on the other hand, it's not really a true fleet carrier. And this is one of the last Japanese carriers to be commissioned, and one of the very few to survive the war. So we've already looked at previous carriers from Hosho to Shoho, Soryu and Hiryu, Kaga and Akagi. We even looked at Teiho. So yeah, let's look at the two sister ships in the Hiyo class and talk about their place in history. Well, these two ships began life in 1938 when they were ordered as luxury liners. This was by the Japanese Mail Steamship Company, NYK. And while when they originally were meant to be civilian ships, the Japanese Navy was always kind of involved. In fact, they subsidized about 60% of their construction cost, with the understanding that the Japanese Navy could purchase them and convert them into aircraft carriers if needed. To that end, from the very beginning, the design was created in such a way that it could easily be adapted and rebuilt. This is something Japan had done multiple times with other warships. You can check out my video on light aircraft carriers. They did this several times with seaplane tenders and submarine tenders and what have you. But in the beginning, throughout 1939 and 1943 of their construction, they were intended to be fast luxury liners. Now, interestingly, the Japanese Steamship Company only wanted them to go about 24 knots. This was fast enough for their needs, and it was more fuel efficient, but the Navy wanted faster. So they settled on a theoretical top speed of 25.5 knots, but if they were to be built as passenger liners, the equipment would be restricted to operate at about 85% capacity, therefore saving fuel and what have you. And you can really tell that this did start off as something else because it is wider with a different shape bow than normal. It has only 2 screws. It just generally does have a different shape. But even before World War II, and I think to no one's surprise, the Japanese Navy exercised their right to purchase Junyo and Hiyo in February of 1941. And since construction was not complete yet, and since the whole design had been created with the notion of converting it to carrier, this wasn't as difficult as you might think. So, with that in mind, towards the end of their construction, things would get changed up. This ship is just under 720 feet long, but is nearly 90 feet wide at its widest. It's over 24,000 tons standard load, so light load, and over 30,000 tons full load. Like I said, top speed was set to be about 25.5 knots, so actually much slower than other Japanese naval carriers and even battleships at the time, but yeah. And she was designed without catapults or the notion to have catapults. One interesting feature, she was the first Japanese aircraft carrier to have the funnel integrated into her island. Common feature later on with American carriers and what have you. She had your typical anti-aircraft defenses, 40mm, 25mm cannon. Her flight deck was about 690 feet long, just under 90 feet wide. And she had 2 hangar decks. Each was just over 500 feet and just under 50 foot wide and about 16 foot tall. So, relatively capable ship. She could carry up to 54 aircraft. Originally, she was designed for the A5M, D3A, and B5N, but in 1942, this was officially changed to the A6M. Obviously, the Claude was no longer frontline. So with that, the class is a little interesting. Because Hiyo was launched first, this is often considered the Hiyo class, but Junyo actually was commissioned first. So which is it? Junyo was commissioned as an auxiliary carrier in May of 1942, but then after Shoho was lost at Coral Sea, she was put into service alongside Ryujo. And so for the Battle of Midway, she was actually assigned to attack the Aleutian Islands, and on June 3rd would launch her aircraft for the first time against Dutch Harbor. It was an ineffective raid, but hey, at least her fate for this battle, even if she was in a northern force, was much better than other carriers. Of course, after the losses at Midway, she was very quickly reclassified as a standard aircraft carrier, no longer auxiliary. And at this time in July, her sister, Hiyo, was commissioned, and she was just classified as a standard carrier as well. And at this time, they were 2 relatively large carriers. I mean, 54 planes is a lot better than a lot of your light carriers at the time, which were 30-ish planes, 35. And not too far off from your major carriers like Kaga and Akagi, which at this time were carrying about 80 to 85 planes of the modern design. It's also worth pointing out, for better or worse, her engines, since they were originally meant for a commercial ship, were a different style, heavier 2 propellers instead of 4 lighter propellers like you would find on a military ship. But from the get-go, she was designed to carry aviation fuel and to be fitted with arrestor wires and all that good stuff that you'd expect. Plus, her bulkheads were designed in such a way that they could be moved around to provide crew quarters and what have you. I'm actually very pleased to have this model. I ordered it way back in May, along with another model from the same vendor. Well, the other model came in a couple of weeks, and this one was just kind of no-show. I waited and waited, figuring at this point it's lost in the mail. Wasn't so much worried about the money, because I needed a refund, but no one had Junyo in stock anymore for any money. as mentioned, decent price. And I really was about to give up, and then she showed up probably about 10 weeks after I ordered it in the mail. It was from overseas, but it was just from Great Britain, so typically that only takes a week or two. But it came, and that's at the end all that matters. But I wanted it because it is a unique story and a unique looking aircraft carrier. So yeah, after the two sisters were commissioned, they were first stationed operating out of Truk, and then they were assigned to support operations during the Guadalcanal campaign that October. On the 15th, they would encounter a resupply convoy of the Allies, and they would successfully sink the destroyer escorting it. And then Hiyo would experience engine troubles and some other mechanical difficulties. Keep in mind, she's very new, so she has to return home to Japan. Before leaving, she transfers some of her planes to Junyo, and she keeps on with the operation. On the 16th, planes from Junyo will attack the USS South Dakota, as well as a light cruiser. They didn't really do any damage of note, but, they did. However, they did help sink the USS Hornet. Specifically, a torpedo from one of her planes would help deal the final blow to the Hornet. So, we'll give Junyo credit for taking part in that. Credit where credit's due. And from there, she would continue to support operations. In early November, her planes would be transferred to operate from shore to help support the Guadalcanal campaign. And Junyo, with very few planes, if any, was supposed to escort and protect Japanese troop transports, something she was not going to be very successful at doing without her air group. So this was not a good day for her. Many of the transports under her guard were lost or had to turn back. And then, of course, the battle would not go well for the Japanese. And Junyo would continue to give escort to various convoys throughout December and into January of 1943. In February of 1943, Junyo would help evacuate Japanese forces from Guadalcanal, and then she would sail back home, being joined again by her sister ship in March. And basically, their air groups would be detached on and off. 1943 is a pretty quiet time in naval history for this war. It is worth noting that in June, freshly repaired, Hiyo was again damaged, this time by a torpedo, so was in yet again for repairs. In July, Junyo's air group would be transferred off again. Then she would be sent to Singapore as a kind of an aircraft ferry, on and off and on and off. In September, Hiyo was at least more or less repaired and ready for service again. So they began operating. But then on November 5th, it's Junyo's turn. She is hit by a torpedo. And the damage is relatively light, but she still has to go to Kure for repair, mostly to her rudder. And at this time, the two carriers are operating alongside the light carrier Ryuho. And then in February, their air groups are reorganized and whatnot, and Junyo's repairs are complete, and she's again ready for service. So in May of 1944, she's transferred to the Philippines, along with many other Japanese assets, including a total of 9 aircraft carriers there. But the problem is U.S. submarines have the waters patrolled very strongly, and Japan has just really lost the edge. The air groups on Junyo and Hiyo are not at full strength. Their division is not given the priority. What aircraft they can spare are given to more important carriers. And of course, many of the skilled pilots are gone at this point. But then, the Battle of the Philippine Seas. And things only get worse, as you know. During that battle on the 18th, planes from Hiyo and Junyo would be launched against the Allies, but they were ineffective. Partly this was due to the inexperience of many of the pilots, but partly it was because of the excellent air defense that the Allies were able to put up. But on the next day, Hiyo would be lost. She would be hit by 2 or 3 bombs and a torpedo, and this would basically, at first, just it would kill most of the bridge crew, true, and it would knock out one of the engines. But she was still making way, even if it reduced speed. But then, a short time later, fumes would build up, and this would lead to an explosion. These vessels had a crew of around 1,250, and most of Hiyo's was lost. I mean, this was just it. Junyo would not escape without damage herself. She would be hit with 2 bombs. While she wasn't in any direct danger of sinking, her flat deck was knocked out, which really didn't matter that much because she only had 17 planes. She had 16 Zeros and 1 B-6N bomber. After this defeat at the Philippine Sea in July, Junyo's air group would be disbanded, and then she would go in for repairs to her deck. Interestingly, in October of 1944, she would not be at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Instead, on the 27th, she was assigned to take supplies to Borneo. And on the 3rd of November, she was spotted and attacked by an Allied submarine who launched torpedoes, but Junyo's escort destroyer put itself in the path of these and sacrificed itself, going down with all hands to keep Junyo afloat. So she completed her mission, but this was only a temporary reprieve. On December 9th, heading back from Manila, she would be spotted by 3 submarines, a wolf pack, if you will, at this time, and they would successfully torpedo her. Now, she would escape. They would knock out 1 engine, doing damage. She would have flooding, but she would escape back, docking at Sasebo. And about a week later, around December 18th, work would begin on her repair and refit. However, as it would happen, she would never really sail again. Repairs would be underway for a time, but this time Junyo did have some damage. But before they could even get close to completing the job, in March of 1945, they ordered stop working. The Japanese Navy really didn't need the carrier anymore because they didn't really have enough planes to even fly off of it. Plus, resources, metal, personnel, even fuel were so low they didn't feel like they could spare it for a slow kind of converted carrier like this. So even though she could have been restored, they just didn't need her. So in April, she was given a paint job, parked in Sasebo Bay, and later reclassified as a guard ship. Basically a floating anti-aircraft battery for a time that summer. Then at the beginning of August, they would basically salvage her for armaments, any parts. They would pull any guns or anything they could off of her for use elsewhere, essentially leaving her as a half-repaired, half-patched-up floating hulk. And so that's why the Allies just pretty much ignored her. I mean, they felt sorry for her. She was officially surrendered to them on September 2nd, at the official surrender end of the war. And then on October 8th, a team of engineers from the Allies would go on board to evaluate her. At this time, some ships like Hosho were being used to ferry Japanese troops back home, repatriate them. So they wanted to see if she was worth anything, and they quickly determined, nope, total loss through neglect, prior damage. There was just nothing worth anything. They didn't even select her for the nuclear test because her hull was too compromised, I suppose. So in 1946, she was ordered to be scrapped. And the job was complete by 1947. Nevertheless, Junyo was one of the few Japanese carriers to survive World War II, and probably the largest, come to think of it. The other ones that survived, like Hosho, were pretty small light carriers. Interesting story. I like the converted Japanese ships. It's just interesting to see how they tried to make things work for them. And like the other Eagle Moss models, this one's pretty interesting. Pretty heavy and interesting detailing and aircraft on the deck. At least I think so. What do you think? Maybe I'm crazy. I know I'm crazy, but yeah, I think these are neat. Well, with that, I'll let you go. As always, if you could, like, share, and subscribe. If you have any questions, please post them. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon, although not with an aircraft carrier, next time.